still on? Okay, can you hear me now? remarkable how casual all the officers seem to be in the aftermath of this beating. And within a short time after this, when Kelly Thomas is in the ambulance and has been taken to the hospital, Manuel Ramos called dispatch on the radio and had him try Kelly Thomas, identify Kelly Thomas. So, all right, Manuel Ramos is charged with second-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter. And before we get to the instructions on that, let me just explain very quickly that murder is the law of murder. Murder is divided into 2 degrees. An unlawful killing of one human being by another with a state of mind called malice aforethought is murder. And if it's done in certain ways, like if it's done during the commission of a felony or during the commission of a dangerous felony like rape or burglary or robbery, it's first degree. If it's premeditated murder, that's first degree. If it doesn't fit into any of those categories and it's murder, then it's a second degree. And so what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with second degree murder. And the state of mind for murder is called malice aforethought. And malice aforethought, we'll get to the description of that, but there's 2 ways to have malice aforethought. There's express malice and there's implied malice. Express malice is if there's an intent unlawfully to kill a human being. The killing is intentional. That's express malice. That's not what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with implied malice. If a person does acts that are inherently dangerous or doesn't act inherently dangerous to human life and causes the death of another in disregarding the risk that he's putting that person through, the risk of danger to his life, then he has malice aforethought and he's be guilty of second-degree murder. And the act can be either an affirmative act, or it can be an omission. All right, so when we're talking about the second-degree murder, we just put it right. We're not dealing with implied malice. We're not dealing with express malice. We're dealing with implied malice. So, Defendant Ramos is charged with implied malice, second-degree murder in count 1, and he's charged with involuntary manslaughter in count 2. Different ways or theories of liability for this. First of all, by action. He could be guilty of implied malice murder, or by a failure to act. Could be guilty of implied malice murder. And with involuntary manslaughter, it's an unlawful act. It could be an unlawful act that could make him guilty of it could be a lawful act, and we're going to get to these definitions a little more as we go further, but it could be a lawful act done in an unlawful way, or it can be a failure to act. Same kind of thing here. Somebody has a duty to act and he fails to. So count 1, murder in the second degree. To prove the defendant's guilty of the crime, the people have to prove these elements. An element is a required part of the crime. If the elements are not all present, then the crime isn't committed. Okay, first, that the defendant committed an act that caused the death of another person. Second, when the defendant acted, he had a state of mind called malice aforethought. And third, he killed without a lawful excuse or justification. And we'll get to what those are a bit later. All right, implied malice murder by action. So what kind of acts are we looking at? The act. We've talked about the kinds of acts that that Defendant Ramos did substantially already. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to maybe add to that a little bit. The act is the excessive use of force. And by threatening excessive force, his right to use force was forfeited. Or, irrespective of the threat of force, irrespective of that threat, the force used was excessive. So threatening the excessive force. If a police officer uses unreasonable or excessive force while arresting or attempting to arrest or detain or attempting to detain a person, that person may lawfully use reasonable force to defend himself. And a person uses reasonable force. I don't think there's going to be any question here about whether or not Kelly Thomas used reasonable force in an attempt to defend himself. He didn't use any weapons. He didn't do anything that you could possibly consider unreasonable. He just tried to resist. But if a person reasonably believes that he's in imminent danger of unreasonable or excessive force by a peace officer, then he has a right to self-defense. And his force is reasonable if he just uses that degree of force that he believes is necessary to protect himself. And no more force than is reasonably necessary. So Kelly Thomas certainly didn't use any unreasonable amount of force. All he did was resist. He didn't assault, he didn't hit, he just resisted. So this threat is excessive. It's a threat of excessive force. It's a dangerous threat, and it's unnecessary. Dangerous. Manny Ramos knew that he was dealing with a homeless individual, probably somebody who might have some mental problems, and he said so in his prior contacts. He said to here in Exhibit 20A, he's homeless, he's mentally disabled, he's not all there. There's nothing physically wrong with him, just mentally ill. I think he's mentally ill. These are Ramos's words. So you're dealing with a mentally ill person, and you're making these kinds of threats. You're creating a dangerous situation. Or you're dealing with a person who might have some mental impairment. Well, anyway. Further, the observations. You can see Kelly Thomas, what he looks like, how disheveled he is. He has difficulty understanding simple directions. He seems to be slow to comprehend. You have to continuously refocus him to have him do what he's supposed to do. And by all of this, he's demonstrating that there's some mental impairment here. Now, I'm putting up a couple of places, some places of the Fullerton Police Department policy manual. Not with the suggestion that the policy manual gives the statements of the law. It doesn't. In fact, you'll be instructed later. Well, you've been instructed. I don't know if you remember it, but there's an instruction that says not to consider the policy manual as being the law. The law is what's stated in the court's instructions. Nevertheless, what are the police in Fullerton taught about this kind of a situation? What would a reasonable police officer, what should a reasonable police officer be thinking in this kind of a situation? So if you're dealing with somebody who's mentally impaired, what they're saying is that there should be conflict resolution techniques. You should be doing de-escalation techniques, using appropriate language. So that threat is far afield from this. In Corporal Rubio's testimony, I think you could see Corporal Rubio was not a friendly witness to the people, but at least he admitted to this, that when the question was put to him about de-escalation, non-threatening words, calming the situation, yes, sir. In fact, he's saying that we try to treat everybody using calming language and try to de-escalate situations verbally. That's what we do. That's what we generally try to teach. So this threat that was made by Officer Ramos is not something that has any tendency to calm the situation. The threat was unnecessary. Every prior contact with Kelly Thomas, he was obedient, passive, compliant. Now, I have to tell you that this PowerPoint was put together by Mr. Bogardus, Keith Bogardus. I said Craig. I've called you that a few times, but at any rate, and Keith is very thorough, very smart, and smarter than I am. That's why it says de minimis conduct. I would have said, minor, but anyway, de minimis conduct. Thomas representing any kind of threat or to him. So the threat that he's made to Kelly Thomas is entirely unnecessary. You can see by his demeanor that there's no concern about any threat from Kelly Thomas. You can see that he's just relaxing against his car. Kelly Thomas has his hand in his pocket. That doesn't seem to mean much to Manuel Ramos. I mean, normally, if you're concerned about a situation, a police officer doesn't let somebody put his hands in his pocket. No, there's no threat here. You can see by his demeanor here, he's got his hand in his own pocket, legs are crossed, just being comfortable. He has his gun close to where his firearm is pretty much exposed to Kelly Thomas. Kelly Thomas could grab it. Admittedly, Ramos has his hand there, but look how close it is. He's just not worried. Kelly Thomas's hands are not in view. By the way, Officer Ramos is not following through with his orders. At this point, Kelly Thomas is not seated in the same position. And Ramos's attention is not on Kelly Thomas for a while. He's talking to this other person who's passing by. He turns his back to Kelly Thomas, just walks away, leaves him sitting there. So, the obvious thing here is that Kelly Thomas doesn't represent a threat of any sort to Ramos or to anybody else. Thomas has been compliant. He's consented to the search. He's volunteered to go to jail. Just take me to jail, dude. Let's just get it over with, please. Can we go? Ramos, I'm not ready yet. The threat is not one of necessity, it's one of anger. This is anger. The suspected crime, mail taken from the trash can. Now, they didn't know it was taken from the trash can yet, but Ramos didn't even take the time to try to find out. Ramos was anxious to go after Kelly Thomas. Just fucking take him for $4.96. Get a call on him every night. This is not verbal strategy to get compliance. I'm not fucking around anymore, dude. I tried to be nice. He's telling him he's not going to be nice. This is not about getting compliance. This is about being angry with Kelly Thomas. Thomas's apprehension. Of course he's going to have some fear. Look at this, just from this prior contact. You ever been hit by one of these things? How did it feel? The threatening nature of putting the gloves on. The statement that he's putting gloves on, and he's going to go hands-on with Kelly Thomas. He never tells Kelly Thomas that he's going to be arrested, as opposed to fucked up with the defendant's fists. Not fucking around anymore, dude. I try to be nice. Well, you know what he says here. I don't have to repeat it again. He's starting to use the force, starting to push Kelly Thomas around.
Future an RMS for Ronnie Casey Hole.
Which one is it? You go. I can't be for it. Well, you're going to have to go real quick. Put your hands on your knees. No. Do my face? Yeah, what do I? Get ready. Start punching, dude. Well, hey, I'm sick of playing games. Which one is it? Put your fucking hand on your knee. You just fucking with your knees. You just fucking. All right, get off the ground. Get off the ground. Get off the ground.
So there's no statement of an arrest. He doesn't tell him to cooperate. He says, get on the ground. Get on the ground. Why would somebody who knows he's about to get beat by the police get on the ground? All right, now, if you create the right of self-defense in a person, you're the initial aggressor, and you've created in a person the right to self-defense, you don't have a right to use force. You don't have a right to use force. This applies to anyone. It applies to police, anybody else. The only way that you can actually regain the right to use force, if you're the initial aggressor, is that you have to actually, in good faith, try to stop fighting. You have to try to, there has to be an actual attempt for you to break that conduct, to stop it. And he has to have indicated by word or conduct to his opponent, in a way that a reasonable person would understand it, that he wanted to stop fighting, and he had stopped fighting. Now, the way that applies here is that we have Officer Ramos, Defendant Ramos, who's the initial aggressor, and he doesn't have a right to use force, does not have a right to use force, but he proceeds to use force. The only way he could have regained a right to use force would be to have some break in the action, to have some way to tell Kelly Thomas, to convey to him that, you know what, I'm not going to engage in this kind of unbelievable by Kelly Thomas. The only way I can think of is probably to have somebody else do the take him into custody, if you're going to take him into custody, like maybe Officer Wolf or something, because Officer Ramos has already pretty much messed that up. But no matter, he didn't make any attempt to slow down or anything anyway. So. The person being arrested has the right to use reasonable force when he uses that degree of force that he actually believes is reasonably necessary, and he uses no more force than a reasonable person in the same situation would believe is necessary. So, I mean, that's up to you as a jury to determine what a reasonable person in that position of Kelly Thomas would believe, and what force a reasonable person might use to try to resist. all of his resistance was defensive. It was not assaultive. His movements were not assaultive, they were defensive, trying to survive. That's all he was doing. In the words of Dr. Lekowitz, the most basic instinct that we all have is to breathe. You'll do anything to do it. He was trying, by what's seen on the video, he was doing everything he could to breathe. Thomas's statements, again, entirely defensive. And look at the kinds of things he was saying. Please, sir, I'm sorry, help me. I can't breathe. He was repeatedly positioned in a place where his ability to submit was compromised. Now, I'm not putting this up here as some kind of a joke. This depiction of the kinds of injuries received by the police are indicative that they were not assaulted by Kelly Thomas. That this rubbing around on the street, doing these different things, these are not the kinds of injuries somebody might receive if they were being assaulted by another, or if it, so there's the point being they were not being assaulted by Kelly Thomas, and they had no reason to believe that they were, and they had no reason to act in self-defense. Irrespective of the threat, the force was excessive. A police officer can use reasonable force. Reasonable force. Certain opinions were given, particularly by Corporal Rubio, who said that he looked Fullerton police policy. And that opinion, any opinions like that, but Corporal Rubio is the only one, those opinions are stricken. His opinion is stricken. You're ordered to disregard that. It's up to you not to look at the at a police officer from Fullerton. It's up to you to determine whether they use excessive or unreasonable force based on all the circumstances. think if there's any question about whether or not they compressed the breath out of him, that should be erased by seeing that. The inaction. Ramos's failure to act. Failure to act can be an act if there's a duty to act and you don't do it. You'll be instructed. Failure to act is equivalent to the intentional commission of an act. Officer has a duty to exercise reasonable care for the safety of those persons whom the officer. Duty includes the obligation not to expose such persons to an unreasonable risk of injury by third parties. So, Officer Ramos did expose Kelly. He had a duty because he was detaining Kelly Thomas, and he did expose Kelly Thomas to an unreasonable risk of harm by third parties, the other police that he was calling to assist him in overcoming Kelly Thomas's lawful resistance. As this was going on, he was still asking for more help. And you saw in the video, at one point he said, code 3 still. 124 is the identification number for Officer Ramos on that night. And he's saying, code 3 still. We still need more help. We need more officers here. He got Officer Wolf involved. He got Officer Cicinelli involved. He got Officer Hampton involved. He got Officer Craig involved. And Officer Blatney before this was all over. During that entire time, he never called it off. He never did anything to stop his use of unlawful force and his subjecting Kelly Thomas to the danger from these other police officers. He assisted in all the force. He even assisted in rolling Kelly Thomas over on his stomach, making it harder to breathe when they put the hobble on. The police understand that there's some problem. There could be a problem with these hobbles and the kind of position that you leave the person in. And so this is stated in the Fullerton Police Department policy manual, saying that once a person is secured, he should be placed in a seated or upright position and not be placed on his stomach for an extended period, as that might potentially reduce a person's ability to breathe. They recognize that a restrained person should be constantly watched by an officer while in the restraint. The officer is to ensure that the person does not roll onto and remain on his or her stomach. We're worried about breathing here. The officer should not look for signs of the officer should look for signs of labored breathing, and where practical, take appropriate steps to relieve and minimize any obvious factors contributing to this condition, meaning the labored breathing. So, Officer Ramos, who had a duty of care, Officer Ramos, who had a duty to relieve Kelly Thomas because he put him at risk of death. rolling him over on his stomach. Now Ramos walks away. So Officer Ramos, who had a duty to help Kelly. Thank you, Honor.